how do you choose what analog equipment to buy? Now, there's a few things that play a part in why we buy what we buy. I'll tell you the main one, and I'll tell you that first, and that is how attractive, right? And this is, look, this is totally separate from the fact that we buy what we buy because it is good. That's what we're buying it for, because it's an amazing piece of kit. That's number one. But as well, is from a business perspective, it's what that represents, what all these pieces of equipment represent. Now, certain pieces of hardware, i.e. the SPL-IM that I have here and the SPL-PQ, they have a kind of a different status in what they represent differently to something like, let's say, a buzz EQ, right? To the audiophile, the buzz EQ, everybody knows, like, is amazing. But that's to someone that knows all this equipment. To the everyday person who does production, some may not know what the buzz EQ is, but they do know what the SPL PQ is, and they do know what the SPL iron is, because they use the plugins. And generally what happens is people, and this is just natural, they know the plugin's good, and they know the analog hardware is better, and they know that. Majority of people are fully aware of that. So what they do is they kind of say, right, well, here's a piece of equipment that I know very well, and I know how good it is in the box, and they've got it out the box. That plays a massive part from a business perspective as to why we buy certain pieces of equipment. Now, as well, for me, is I like to do A/B demos, compare the plugin to the hardware. I like to use the plugins. So when I use the plugins, I'll get used to using the plugin. I'll love using the plugin. The HG2 over there, I love using the plugin. I think it's a brilliant plugin. The plugin is actually really, really good. So when I was able to buy the HG2 hardware, it was a no-brainer for me, because I know the plugin, I know the hardware instantly. The hardware's better, but the plugin's close. And by having two, when you're using the plugin and you've got the hardware, you use the hardware in a different way to the plugin. But as soon as you start using the hardware, you start to use the plugin in a very similar way to how you use the hardware. So it kind of makes you a little bit better on the plugin. So there's multiple reasons why we buy certain pieces of equipment if it's got mid-side. If it's got mid-side built into it, brilliant. That's an added benefit that, you know, having mid-side in anything is brilliant. There's multiple reasons. Another good one is some units, right? Some cheaper units and even some more expensive units have a lot higher kind of surface noise, and they'll introduce some kind of aspects of noise that, from a mastering perspective, it all adds up. If you've got lots of pieces of equipment that add up to a lot of noise, you know, we've got a really, really, really clean chain. But I'll tell you this, I added the Buzz REQ 2.2 in, and bearing in mind, this is like a $7 grand EQ, one of the best. It has a tiny bit of noise in it that isn't, I mean, it's minimal, it really is, but it's still something to bear in mind when buying equipment, because this is a high-end piece of equipment and it has that tiny bit of noise. Whereas something that's kind of, let's say a Behringer piece of equipment, not to dig fun at Behringer or anything, but you pick up a Behringer or an Art Pro VLA, you know, something like that. It's relatively cheap. There's a lot of surface noise and there's a lot of noise that gets added to the chain, whereas high-end Class A gear doesn't have so much of that, but it still has a little bit. That's always something to bear in mind. Now, a lot of pieces of equipment have status. They have a kind of a heritage. They have a kind of, they have this kind of place on a mantelpiece, I guess. It's just like this piece of equipment that is incredible. Everybody knows about it. People come to us for it. Something like we've got next door, the Unfairchild 670M Mark II. Now, that is a compressor that everybody comes for. Now, I mean, it's a £14,000 compressor, and it is one of the best in the world. It is incredible. It's a direct clone, basically, of the Unfairchild. It's the modern day Fairchild, and it sounds as fantastic, and it is unbelievable how good it is. So we get people coming through the door wanting their songs run through that every single time. We get about probably one email a day where someone will say, I want it run through the Unfairchild. I want it run through that. Those sorts of pieces of equipment, they have this status around them that people want their songs put through. Same thing with our Shadow Hills compressor. Same thing with our Alpha compressor. People want their songs put through these pieces of equipment, and that does play a big part. And bear in mind that everything I'm talking about is very much from a business perspective. Like I said at the start of the video, number one is sound. Getting the best possible equipment is key, but from a business perspective, it's as much about how it sounds as well as what it represents and what it can bring through the door. If you spend 14 grand on a compressor, and 14 grand's worth of people come through the door in the first month because of that compressor, it's worth its weight in gold. It's paid for itself within a month. So that sort of thing, certain pieces of equipment do have that status that is what they're good for. Ultimately, number one is they're good for a brilliant sound, but number two is people want to see them, people want to hear them, and they want to hear their tracks run through them.